I think we are now live, and I just want to welcome you to this Salter Baxter conversation on regenerative agriculture. So thank you very much for joining. What we can say is you can use your chat function. So if you would like to send in any questions, use the chat function. We will try and get to those. We have a way of those questions finding themselves to me, and we will try and get to those questions. But I just want to welcome you, and I want to welcome our fantastic panel. We've had a late and fantastic addition to the panel. We have David Croft from Reckitt Benckiser. So David, thank you for joining again. We have otherwise on the other three panelists circulated biographies, so we hope you have seen those. But I thought we should start with a round of brief introductions. So Sarah, if we could start with you, please.
Hi, good evening, good morning, everybody. My name is Sara Posa. I'm a senior researcher at World Benchmarking Alliance, where my work focuses mostly on the food and agriculture benchmark. I will leave it at that, so keep it very short.
Perfect, Sarah. And Ryan, please.
Good morning, good evening, everyone. Yeah, Ryan Stockwell, Director of Regen Crop Systems in North America for the Nature Conservancy, where we work to scale up enabling conditions to allow farmers to adopt regenerative practices. And I also farm here in Wisconsin.
And Hannah.
Hi, thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here. Hannah Koski, I have responsibility for corporate sustainability and ESG at US Foods. We are a North American broadline food service distributor and also have a background in agriculture as well.
And our late and welcome addition, David.
Thank you, Dex, and hi, everybody. I'm David Croft. I lead sustainability at Reckitt, and that covers all of our global supply chains. I'm also a member of the TNFD task force and have spent time across the food sector in different brands in agriculture from both the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere on a range of different crops.
Thank you, David. So let me just set the scene a little bit, very, very briefly. The big picture is on the upside, there is now a very healthy attention in the corporate sector to help the global economy go nature positive by 2030. There is also companies are now realizing that they do need to set nature targets and have nature plans and not just be preoccupied with carbon targets as we've seen in recent years. And there is this very welcome attention on the buzz that is regenerative agriculture. So that is the upside. The downside, if there is one perhaps, is that the criticism has been that companies are not yet giving clear definitions of regenerative agriculture, or at least not many companies are doing that. There are not many clear targets and clear plans either. And if you remember the FAIR report that came out last year, its survey showed that only 36% of companies in its survey had concrete targets, and there was only 8% of companies who mentioned any financial support to farmers in the supply chain. So there is this sort of mixed picture of a very sort of upside of a healthy focus, a healthy push on nature and regenerative agriculture, but a kind of downside of perhaps a lack of clear definitions, targets, and plans. Sarah, would you agree with that? And in that case, in that mixed picture, do you think we're making progress?
Yeah, thanks, Dax. And I mean, maybe just as a brief context, as I said, I work on the food and agriculture benchmark at WBA, which is a benchmark that assesses the 350 most influential food and agriculture companies on and their corporate reporting on topics that includes environment, nutrition, social, and governance. And when we look at regenerative agriculture, actually, the picture that we see from the results of the benchmark are pretty much similar to what you just actually highlighted. Basically, the latest results from the benchmark show that regenerative agriculture is gaining traction. More than half of the companies are reporting and implementing regenerative agricultural practices. But when we look at more specifically at how they're setting commitments, only 5% are actually setting clear and specific targets, for example, tackling soil health improvement or reduction in input use or improving agrobiodiversity. And maybe another key aspect to highlight here is also that farmers and the role of farmers is also getting more central in the approach to regenerative agriculture, but it's still not the majority, because less than 27% of the companies are actually reporting evidence or sharing that they are supporting farmer livelihoods in this transition towards more regenerative agriculture practices.
Thanks, Sarah. And Ryan, do you think we're seeing progress?
Yeah, slowly. It's getting there. It's taking time. We're certainly seeing it on the corporate front with a lot more interest to establish programs to help farmers adopt some of these regenerative practices. But there's also a lot of uncertainty yet for farmers, so they're still a little hesitant and holding back. So they're essentially, we need to see more enabling conditions in order to really see the widespread adoption that we're all looking for here.
Okay, thank you. And David, what's your sort of view of the picture at the moment?
I think we are seeing progress, and I think it's driven by a raft of different elements. The visibility of biodiversity in nature over the last couple of years has risen dramatically. We've got a much clearer global direction around it. But what's also driving that is, and I'll make a blatant plug about this, is the way that TNFD and other mechanisms are developing, and therefore also the role of the investor community in this conversation. I'm not breaching any confidences when I say that our largest investors have been asking me very clearly, what is our approach on nature? How are we potentially addressing nature-related financial risks in the same way that we're already addressing climate-related financial risks? And what is our mechanism around both targets, metrics, and therefore interventions to mitigate those risks? So it's becoming mainstream, as well as being a driver of climate-related activity as well. And I think making certain we see the two together at the core of supply chain conversations will be seriously important about resilience for the future.
And with investors, presumably, climate is still a higher priority, but nature is a high priority.
Well, it is a high priority. I'd say they see climate as a massive risk and priority, therefore. But to be honest, when we include within nature water, as well as the reliance that many people have on natural raw materials, potentially the impact is more immediate, depending on where your value chains are in the world.
Right. Thank you. And Hannah, you've been very honest with me when we spoke, and you sort of said that US Foods is quite early in the journey of regenerative agriculture, which is where most companies are at, which I think what we've just all touched on. So in that sort of mixed picture, and because a company who's early in the journey, how do you start to make credible claims?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have to speak to frameworks like the TNFD for helping to encourage the conversation at US Foods. So, I think when we talk about progress for a company like US Foods, that really starts with us with having the conversation and just starting to raise some awareness and build, a conceptual understanding of how nature might relate to some of our other targets, goals, for example, related to Scope 3, where we have recognized as a business that we have risk and where we are working to integrate those into our business strategy. But obviously, we also face a lot of headwinds. I think that's particularly true for companies like US Foods. So just for context, we have around 6,000 suppliers, more than 400,000 products. And in a lot of instances, we are working with tier 2, 3, 4 suppliers. That's where raw material begins, and we are several steps removed. So, for us, some of the challenges, how do we make those claims with confidence? And then also, how do we quantify them so we can tie them back to our Scope 3 or other related commitments? We think about that two ways, right? So we're making customer-facing claims related to products. And then, like I said, those claims as they relate back to our business strategy and to our sustainability initiatives. We're trying to raise that awareness, have conversations like this with experts in the field to figure out how we can do that confidently, trying to look to existing standards, certifying bodies, research as it exists that we can then use to really quantify and feel confident in some of the claims that we are making and in our decision making as relates to strategy.
And staying with you, Hannah, how do you begin to bring the climate and nature agendas together?
Yeah, I mean that starts with a lot of science, which again for a food service distributor is not necessarily something that always comes first and most naturally to our various decision makers. So connecting the dots for us has really been an exercise in trying to better understand our supply chain, to develop that traceability, that visibility, and then to understand where we have risk. And as relates to nature, looking at things like deforestation, for example, and understanding the direct connection between deforestation or land conversion, agricultural practices as impact that, and then greenhouse gas emissions related to forest lands and agriculture has been a huge step in connecting those dots. I think similarly thinking about things around ecosystem services to points that have been made around water, for example, that these things work together. So as we've been talking about deforestation, it has prompted and necessitated conversations around other sustainability attributes and additionally social attributes as well. So issues like protecting Indigenous people's rights and protecting communities and engaging them in decision making. And so we have found that we are not just connecting nature to climate through better understanding our supply chain and risk and opportunity, but some of those other social priorities as well.
Okay, so it's interesting to see that the agendas, social, climate, nature, increasingly coming together. Just going back, this is really I will start with Sarah. In terms of this idea that we need clearer definitions coming out from the private sector. I mean, actually, funny enough, I was talking to a person at Earthwatch, and they were sort of saying, look, let's not get too stuck on having definitions, but there should be at least a clear direction of travel, let's say. I mean, I wonder, Sarah, if you agree with that. And, is it all about the carbon, the soil, the water, and the biodiversity? Those seem to be the four things emerging generally to be under the regenerative agriculture umbrella. I mean, Sarah, is it about those things, Sarah, or is it about something more?
Is it definitely about those things? But I think there are a mix of like agricultural land management practices that can have equally positive impact on nature and biodiversity. So that's why we shouldn't be there's the work that is going on now is not really on coming up with one definition, but sort of setting out the main principle for regenerative agriculture. So for example, at WBA, we follow the developments of initiatives like Region 10 or OB2B, the One Planet Business for Biodiversity, that are working on getting a bit more clarity and alignment on what we mean with regenerative agriculture. And for example, at WBA, when we want to monitor progress on regenerative agriculture, we basically, and on the commitment, for us, a clear commitment is a time-bound and outcome-based target. So it means that the commitment is clear to measurable indicators that are actually able to demonstrate that the company's practices are having a positive impact on nature and biodiversity. And these indicators could be showing soil improvements in terms of reducing soil erosion, increasing agrobiodiversity, or could be about reducing water withdrawal, especially from water-stressed areas. So it could be many different things, but it's important that the outcome, the positive outcome of these activities is measurable and clear. And this is, as I said, in alignment with what existing initiatives are working on to try to bring more clarity around this.
And Sarah, when you are benchmarking companies, I think what you were saying is you are looking for a clear communication for how that company articulates the regenerative agriculture goals, the direction of travel. You're looking for clear targets and you're looking for clear indicators. Would that be a good summary? Is there anything else you're looking for?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, it's about setting these very clear and measurable time-bound targets, but also disclosing maybe quantitative data on these practices, as I said, that show the positive outcome. So basically, it's about having the target and showing the progress in quantitative terms. And also, I mean, we see leaders in the industry that have come up with frameworks for regenerative agriculture that have been developed in consultation, especially with farmers, partners where they have set out these principles, and they can use as sort of pathway to guide and set their commitments and monitor their progress.
Would you say it's easy to jump forward in the rankings? I mean, if you do some simple steps, is it easy for companies? I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but can companies move up quite rapidly?
I mean, if the company is able to show a clear commitment, and especially that it's reporting progress on the commitment, then definitely they can gain some position in the benchmark, because it's all about being transparent, disclosing data, and setting like ambition high and having like a clear target. So if you meet all these criteria, then you can definitely jump on the top, or at least be like in front of your peers.
I think anyone out there is grateful for some cheeky tips on how to move forward, as always. But Ryan, coming to you, is it about the soil, the water, the biodiversity? Is there something more to it?
Yeah, I think it is. It's about all of those, and for me and for the Nature Conservancy, it always comes back to what is it that we're asking farmers to do to accomplish these multiple outcomes. So what does that look like? And in a lot of situations, when it comes to regenerative farming, the practices that everybody thinks about that fit those principles of regenerative agriculture do accomplish multiple outcomes, from soil to water to biodiversity to carbon. So, that's part of the beauty of regenerative agriculture. It accomplishes so much of what we're looking for.
And David, would you agree with Ryan's summary there?
Absolutely. You have to take into account what you're asking farmers to do, and then how you cement that in. You touched on it earlier, Dax. There has to be a socioeconomic element to the solution. Is it the thing that you report? Not necessarily, but if you don't have it, then why would you necessarily get longevity of solution? And why would a farmer want to do more? It has to be part of a sustainable supply chain solution, that there is a sustainable livelihood that flows to the farmer at the heart of it. That's why when in the work that we've been doing, we have robust qual and quant metrics at a farm and landscape level. But we also associate that with a premium payment to the smallholder farmers that we've been working with to help that to stay in place, because then it cements the activity with them. And I think that starts to create a bit of a transition towards stronger ecosystem services payments, where the value that is delivered is more than proverbially the commodity crop that is purchased. And that's great from a farmer point of view. It's great from our point of view because it mitigates risk, creates resilience, builds opportunity. But it also means that the farmer not only may get a more robust payment, but also and there's some great work that a Swiss investment bank has been doing that talks to how it increases the value of the land that the farmer owns, which strengthens the farmer's equity and so on. So this becomes win-win. The thing that is different is it's at a local level, and therefore what might have been considered a globally traded commodity of the same spec suddenly stops becoming that, because you value not just the product that you've bought, but how it is farmed, the way the land is managed, and the additional benefits of nature resilience and climate resilience and even social resilience for the communities at the heart of it that come from it. That changes the dynamic quite a lot from the more traditional commodity procurement system.
So there may be a shared cost between companies and farmers in the supply chain, but there's also a shared resilience.
It definitely adds value. I mean, what we're seeing and what the Swiss investment house Lombard Odier have identified is that land value goes up for the farmers involved. And if they're farming in a certain way that is valued because of that climate and nature resilience, then their land is actually more valuable than the farm next door.
Yeah. And staying with you, Dave, I just want to go back to this idea of targets that are being published by companies where they're at the moment few and far between. I've noticed three types of targets. There's a financial one what's the size of the fund for regenerative agriculture. There's one about sourcing, what proportion of ingredients will come from regenerative sources in 2030. And then there's a hectares one. Unilever will talk about tens of thousands of hectares that will come under regenerative farming. I mean, are those three camps helpful? Should one be more of a priority?
I think you'll see a fourth camp appearing, Dax, because I think whilst all those three are helpful, they're more directional than specific. And to Sarah's point, the critical thing here is the impact that you make and how you're improving biodiversity. And I think what you'll start to see is, based on stronger biodiversity metrics, you'll start to see changes and improvements in biodiversity that are beyond the percentage of the crop that comes in, or the land use the land space available. And I think sometimes land space can actually be pretty misleading, because how many people actually recognize what, I don't know, 1 million hectares looks like? And actually, how significant is 1 million hectares in any individual value chain? It's really very difficult for people to quantify. I think what's coming, and certainly I'm seeing this through TNFD, is much more specific impact metrics. And so you then start saying, I have improved nature by X in these ways. And that becomes much more quantifiable. And, if I frame this back against a TNFD positioning, for example, if I'm, as we will do progressively, declaring a nature-related financial risk of however many pounds, then by definition, you need to be able to show impact metrics that help to demonstrate how you're mitigating that risk. Saying a percentage of, or a land hectarage, unless you give quantifiable elements of proportionality within that, isn't enough. You need to be more specific as you go forward.
And Hannah, when you're thinking about US foods and how the targets will evolve in future, and you're looking at land space, you're looking at the proportion of ingredients from regenerative sources, you're looking at the size of the fund, whether that's impressive or not, and then what David's talking about in terms of biodiversity and more detailed metrics. I mean, how do you see US foods, the targets panning out in future in terms of, winning credibility?
I mean, I think certainly the extent to which there are defined, recognized, agreed upon, quantifiable metrics, the easier it is for companies to start to work in the direction of driving those positive outcomes. One of the big risks that we see today in association with any claims, like we talked about, is the kind of evolving scrutiny and litigation environment around claims. And so simultaneously, companies like US Foods are in this position where we are being asked for increased transparency, disclosure, and simultaneously an environment that is really critical of those claims and not uninclined to potentially put out a lawsuit in relation to. And so we're always trying to navigate that. And I think, again, where there are metrics that we can measure that we know are generally recognized as doing a very specific thing, achieving a very specific outcome, if we can plan, strategize against those, and then disclose them specifically and speak specifically to what outcome we are driving, rather than making broader claims around things like how many acres are using regenerative agricultural practices, et cetera, we're in much better position to not only drive the positive impact, but to mitigate our associated legal risk, which is something that any kind of large company is obviously going to be considering. And I just wanted to go back to the question around sort of, is it all about the soil and the water and the health? And just reiterate the point too. I know we talked about that shared value creation, right, from farmer all the way through business, and that's both in terms of mitigating risk, but also that long-term business resiliency. And I think what's really exciting about the corporate environment today, as it's thinking about sustainability, is in increasingly considering those long-term risks. So you see this with climate. It's really evolved with frameworks like TCFD, where you're thinking not just about what's going to impact a business in the next 3-5 years, but in 25, 40, 50, are you still going to have the same supply chain continuity that you need to run your business effectively? And we're already starting to see disruption to that, right? We see supply chain disruption that negatively impacts our ability to deliver product to our customers. We see inflation associated with things like extreme weather events, et cetera. And so back to the point around there being a real monetary benefit to these more resilient farming practices, and as such, supply chains. I certainly see a world where that is a shared value across the entire value chain. I think you see that today, and I think it's going to continue to evolve as well.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I guess investors, but also the business itself wants to see that shared risk being managed,
Right.
and the shared value and the shared resilience. I suppose other kinds of stakeholders want to see a bit. They want to see that, but they do want a bit of a breakdown in soil, water, and biodiversity, don't they? And I suppose, Ryan, as a stakeholder, you're not probably going to litigate. Possibly, you're at this huge, incredible environmental group. You're also a farmer. I mean, what kinds of targets are you looking for when you're sort of trying to assess the seriousness of a company's commitment?
That's a great question, and I think in many ways I would agree with Hannah's assessment that we're looking for credible, quantifiable results, and we know that sometimes that can be difficult to accomplish. So then we look for other indicators that at least can show that a corporation is in the right direction in their sourcing, so that if we can't provide that exact measurement, if those numbers about carbon or soil health cannot be easily quantified, well, then what are the next indicators that we can find that can tell us that they're at least in the right direction? And that's something, I think that reality is really critical for a lot of farmers out there that, we've heard this in the carbon credit space, that farmers are a little averse to all of the additional data required to participate and to prove out some of these results. So how do we ensure that we're getting the right information up the supply chain while at the same time not overburdening farmers in the collection of that data?
Yes, I think that's right. Incoming question, and a good one for you, Ryan, I think. So from our audience, we don't have a name. How do you scale regenerative agricultural practices, as there are limits to holistic crop growth and animal rearing?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the agricultural sector and the support system around farmers, we think about how we all make assumptions about what is defined as the best way to farm. And a lot of those definitions that have been created in the past have made some really big assumptions about what to observe and what to focus on and what to ignore. And we're seeing that shift, that now that definition of good farming now starts taking into consideration long-term health of that soil. That's like, that on its own is a fundamental shift that we're seeing for farmers. And now we're starting to see that ag support network starting to realize that we need to do a much better job of thinking about that in the products and the guidance that we offer to farmers. So when we talk about enabling those conditions, it's about all of those factors. So the agronomic advice available to farmers, how well does that line up with providing a crop, but also meeting some of these new definitions of what it looks like to be a good farmer and to farm well? To finance, how do we ensure that the finance available to farmers, again, if the lenders are getting value of reducing risk to that repayment of that loan, how do they encourage that farmer to adopt those practices and to go down that path? And so when we look at all of these different sectors that can enable, we should all be looking at how do we make those changes within those systems?
And just continuing on this, because I mean, you can help us, Ryan, get into the headset of a farmer, because I think one thing we're hearing is there has got to be some kind of financial support from companies to get into this shared resilience. And we're seeing these huge protests across Europe and other continents because of the financial pressures they're under. So could you talk to that? But I think also, having talked to you before this event, you were saying it's not all about the money. It's about 100 other things where farmers are having to balance inputs. They've got a whole lot of headaches. They're trying to prepare their land for the next harvest. I mean, there's other things that are non-financial. So start with the financial, and then if you would, just take us into the mind of a farmer.
Yeah. So for a lot of farmers, the mentality here, we are not necessarily rational economic decision makers. right? So we have to start with that understanding. If we were rational economic decision makers, we would probably not be in farming. This is too high risk to be very rational. We're dealing with markets, wild swings in markets. We're dealing with wild weather. We're dealing with diseases and pests. It not very rational to want to fight that day in and day out. Instead, it's a much different context that we're dealing with more of a gambling mentality where there's risks and rewards, and we're okay to balance those as long as the rewards balance the risks. And I think that's part of the pressure that we're seeing, and some of the pushback that we're seeing from farmers is they're feeling like they're being asked to take on more risk without any necessary additional reward to come of it. At least at the current time, that reward is not very clear to them. It may be coming to them in ways that we just aren't measuring and providing to them just yet. Talking about certainty of supply chains or increases in land value, those are high values, but we're not doing a very good job of communicating them or quantifying them so that the farmer can then make that decision. Yes, in fact, this is a good risk to take, and I'm going to take it. And so when we provide that information, that helps them to think about these new practices in the same ways that they've been farming before, which is, this makes sense for me long-term, even short-term, and it's a risk I'm willing to take. But I think the struggle isn't necessarily that the incentives aren't there. We're just not communicating them very well.
And I'll come to Hannah and David in a second, but Ryan, if you were advising a company on how a business can best provide support to farmers in their supply chain, I mean, what would you be saying?
Yeah, I think we need to talk about, first and foremost, if you want to get farmers' attention about adopting some of these practices, we need to do a better job of showing how these practices solve major headaches and major problems for that farmer. That's a constant battle that we're going through every day. And there are times when those battles keep us up at night. So if you're able to offer a solution to me that provides something that you need, but more importantly, helps me solve a problem, then you've got my ears and I'm paying attention. I think we just haven't done a very good job of talking about regenerative in that way. We talk about it in long-term value of it's building your soil health. It's going to be better in the future. It's going to help deal with this major global problem. But how does this solve my struggles right now, this year, this crop season? So if we start answering that question, I think you'll see a lot more engagement from farmers.
I think that's so useful to have your perspective, Ryan, because I mean, Hannah, when we previously spoke, you said as a food services company, you're quite distant from this part of the supply chain from farmers. I mean, how do you think in future US Foods might, listening to Ryan, and I'm sure you've got many experiences yourself, how do you intend to, increase your support for farmers?
Yeah. I mean, it's such a great point, right? We are so many steps removed. And so I don't know that we ever get the opportunity to hear what some of those farmer challenges are and how changing their agricultural practices or pursuing certain certifications, et cetera, might help to address those challenges. So, I think given that remove, one of the things that we've been really focused on is just how can we help to create market for products that might be produced in such fashion that they are more sustainable, that leverage regenerative agricultural practices. How can we help to send a signal to our suppliers, who are often the suppliers that are then going out and engaging with farmers again, maybe even 1-2 steps removed, but how can we send a signal that this is an area where we are focused? This isn't an area that we see as emerging, that we believe is going to, satisfy consumer trends, because at the end of the day, all this food is getting to the end consumer, and they need to want to support these types of claims as well. And so what role can we play in helping to demonstrate that that is true, that is where we see the direction going, and then create those pathways to market for our suppliers so that they are in a good position to have the conversations with the farmers from whom they are procuring raw materials.
Thank you, Hannah. And David, same question to you.
I think there's a range of things that you can do across that value chain. And it's tailored around, what matters locally to those particular farmers. So what we would do with the smallholder in southern Thailand is going to be very different to what we do with a large dairy farmer and with a large dairy farmer in North America, for example. I think Ryan's point about risk is well made. With the best will in the world, many farmers, and forgive me for putting it as bluntly as this, Ryan, many farmers are risk averse. But that's because there isn't a guarantee that how much rain is going to fall next month. It could be too much, it could be too little. The chance of being just right is actually quite slim, increasingly so. And so to ask farmers to make changes against a backdrop that is already a little bit uncertain because of changing weather patterns is asking a lot to begin with. And so there are ways that you can go about changing that dynamic. You can get crop risk insurance that you can help to underwrite to reduce it. You can give different incentives and opportunities like longer term contracts. Like even in the past when I've worked in UK retailing with UK farmers, having a contract with us as a supermarket got them reduced rates through various banks because of the continuity and the strength of the contract that it gives. There are ways you can create a stronger ecosystem that brings value to the farmer that matters to that farmer. As well as what I was saying earlier about valuing the product, the crop, in a subtly different way, not just for the kilo of latex that I buy from a smallholder rubber farmer, or for a gallon of milk that I buy from a US dairy farmer, or whatever else it might be. But thinking about what's the value of longevity? What's the value of reducing the carbon footprint of those products by avoiding deforestation or stopping cows burping? What's the value of nature that helps to support long-term resilience of that value chain so the farmer works in a certain way? In the case of the rubber farmers, doesn't put fertilizer near the river courses, doesn't affect ecosystems in a wider basis, both on farm and off farm. That actually allows us to reward the farmers even more directly in the future as well, once it's quantifiable. And so I think there are some broad principles of how you create value with that farmer on top of the product that you buy. And then how do you spread that message? And how do you take it through groups of suppliers, maybe on a horizontal level rather than just vertical? And how do you work with suppliers and farmers to build that understanding and knowledge? And there are ways to do that, but it's also where peer group helps as well. You know, if you're thinking about forest products, the collaborations that you can create through landscape activity, through people like CGF, for example, where we work with peers on how farming methodology works, and therefore you're collectively rewarding it, creates scale faster. So, long answer to a short question. It's complex, it needs to be local, it needs to create sustainable value for the farmer, but you can do that in a multiple number of ways.
And Ryan, having heard that from Hannah and David from the sort of business end, as it were, I mean, is that sort of it sort of chimes in with a lot of the things you said. Would you agree massively, or is there anything else to add to that?
No, I would wholeheartedly agree with those assessments. Right, price is one way to communicate a value, but there are additional ways. Maybe we can provide that longevity of contract. Maybe we can help offset some of that risk of farming a new crop or farming it in a new way with the underwriting with crop insurance. So, when we look at it that way, now we start thinking about all those different ways that we can communicate and share that value. Yeah, now we can talk about maybe there's loan agreements out there for purchasing the right equipment at favorable terms, so that initial upfront, sometimes really high cost upfront can be smoothed out and allow that farmer to make those purchases necessary to start shifting over to reduced tillage or adding cover crops. So, when we start opening up all those different ways of thinking about the value and thinking about what are the factors that the farmers need to think about, yeah, it opens up a whole menu of options for us to consider and how to share that value.
Sarah, if you were sort of trying to think about in all your dealings, best practices generally in the corporate sector around regenerative farming, but also best practices where companies and farmers are collaborating. Is there anything you've particularly seen that might be good for the conversation?
Yeah, so as I said before, I think the best practices that we've seen so far is mostly when companies are setting these very clear frameworks where they outline these key principles linked to could be like a very quantifiable target. So this is concerning the part of setting commitment when it comes to supporting farmers, as like in line with what has been discussed so far. We do see like multiple ways that companies can support farmers in this in implementing these practices, and this is, for example, indeed like helping farmers collecting data, giving technical advice, yeah, but also, for example, assessing their level of the income and see how they can support them. Also providing, for example, premium prices for certain commodities that are produced with more sustainable practice. So there's many ways that, and there is in the segment definitely some companies that are taking more bold action. It's just that indeed the progress is low, and it's just a couple of leading practices, and the rest of the sector is a bit lagging behind and working on, you know, formulating more specific targets, trying to understand a bit better their suppliers and get more data. So there's some work going on, but yeah, the progress is a bit slow.
We're coming towards the end of this incredibly useful conversation with some great insights from very different perspectives, but I think a lot of agreement, which is reassuring. I think, Sarah, I mean, first of all, if there's any other questions from our audience, please send them through. Sarah, if you were going to advise a business which is only starting to consider this area, and you're trying to advise a couple, well, how to, you've kind of already told us, but how to feature well in your benchmarking. But what would your sort of advice be to companies who need to do this right? They need to be credible. It's a lot of hype, a lot of buzz. What is your advice for a company to really get into this deep area in a very credible way?
Yeah, I think first of all, follow the developments of these initiatives that are working on getting more clarity around regenerative agriculture. As I mentioned before, there's the Region 10, the Work for Board Business Council for Sustainable Development with OP2B. They are working on metrics, and they are using like multi-stakeholder platforms to also communicate this. So I think that could be definitely a starting point. And of course, I mean, trying to collect as much data as possible, as much transparency as possible from the supply chain, so that they have more clarity about, you know, how their suppliers are working with farmers, and the farmers' needs. So I would say these are the key things to start with.
Thank you. And Hannah, your top tips.
Yeah, I mean, I think they certainly build on Sarah's points. So I think that you need to understand your supply chain, and then within that, know what you want to accomplish. So based on your own business and what you're looking to achieve in terms of risk mitigation, identifying opportunity, and the way that then ties back to nature, I think knowing that first, trying to align that with some of these recognized metrics, and then setting very intentional strategies to achieve those particular goals and outcomes, rather than kind of being overwhelmed by the broad scope that you might tackle, right? I think being really clear and specific on what you want to do and why that is of value back to your business and stakeholders.
Thank you, Hannah. And David, what would your best advice be?
Not surprisingly, very similar. Really understand the origins to begin with. Understand the material issues in terms of nature and the connection to carbon and socioeconomic elements within there. Build the right metrics so that you can measure the impact and the changes, and choose the right interventions, therefore, that give best value to make the biggest change. And lastly, and this might sound a bit weird, don't try to do everything everywhere all at once. This is a big, wide agenda. The one thing that we found at TNFD that puts people off most is the scale of it. So find the really significant biodiversity and nature impacts in the first instance and begin activity there. Get enough detail on the metrics and drive that. Definitely don't try and do everything everywhere all at once.
I think that's interesting because I mean, ideally, you do identify your nature hotspots, the sensitive areas under particular threat, and start there and do it well and grow from there. So I think that's good advice. And Ryan, your best advice, but also best advice to business, but in the farming world, I mean, it's quite a big ask, as you have said and others have said, to go from no-tilling to cover cropping. I mean, that's quite a jump into a very different kind of new approach. So Ryan, your advice for business, but also have you sort of seen that in the farming world, that sort of those big shifts?
Well, yeah, I'll answer your first question. So the advice to businesses, if I could stack on to some of the advice shared from the other panelists, is to think about the strategy. So how do we enable the entire ecosystem around farmers to convey the value to adopting these practices? I think it's absolutely necessary, in fact, to think about that entire ecosystem. If we have a supply chain sending a signal for regenerative practices, and yet the agronomic advice and the insurance and the financing and everything else that the farmer works with to make a farm operate is still operating under the old rules and the old assumptions, we are going to have conflict. And that farmer is going to 99 times out of 100 make the decision to stay with the status quo for as long as possible because it's the least risky. So I think it's critical to think about how do you engage other partners to enable that context so that that farmer feels fully supported and it's a very clear decision then. So to answer your second question then, we are starting to see some of those shifts. We're seeing that in farmers who have been frustrated with, various problems on their operation, or they're seeing the threats and the changes that are going on. They're seeing, we hear a lot of stories about farmers who see excessive soil erosion, and that was just too much to bear, or they're seeing that their fields that are just becoming so sensitive to drought now. And so they're starting to witness it is becoming clear by the conditions of the soil in their farm fields that it's far enough from the baseline. They're seeing the change now that they're becoming motivated to then say, how do I do this differently? But we're still seeing a number of farmers that are a little resistant, a little reticent to make that jump for some of the reasons that we've discussed here. So we need to continue to make it a clear message that there are changes going on in those fields that are putting their own productivity at risk.
Hannah, Sarah, Ryan, David, this has been an incredibly rich conversation. I think we've gone off the beaten track. I think we haven't been repetitive with other events out there. We've had a really good conversation. I want to thank you all, four of you, very, very much for giving your time to this and sharing your insights. I'm going to ask our audience to send you waves of a silent applause because we won't hear from our audience due to the technical setup. I want to say to the audience, thank you so much also for joining us and for listening. Salter Baxter is, we can see some claps, which is good. Salter Baxter is very active now in this area of regenerative agriculture. It's such a key area for sustainability for many companies on their journey. So please get in touch if you want to compare notes. And we're really sort of developing our experiences in this incredibly fluid area and new area. So thank you so much for joining. Thanks to our panel again. Thanks to the audience, and look out for more sessions of this kind in future. But I'll let you all go, and thank you so much for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.